Hello everybody, Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is the Schaftlein Report, Tuesday's edition, broadcasting from beautiful Irvine, California. Happy to have you back with us today. Well folks, as we mentioned earlier in the week, and to no surprise, the Biden administration's made a decision to release oil from the strategic reserve. We gave you some commentary last week when we talked about the economics of this, that in the short term you may get a slight bump, but boy, in the midterm and long term, this will do absolutely nothing to alleviate the supply problems that we have. And it's really sort of, you hear the words accounting gimmicks, it's really an oil gimmick. Congress had previously approved the release of 18 million barrels, which the Biden administration is going to utilize. But now they've also done what's called a 32 million barrel swap, meaning they're going to release, release 32 million barrels, but under contract, it has to be replaced within a certain period of time. So those are known as swaps, and that's what's going to happen with this. Based upon what they did, the price of oil is actually up today, to no surprise. And I applaud the administration for thinking about this, but as the saying goes, could be too little too late. Consumers are really feeling the pain at the gas pump. This will, at best, provide some short-term relief, which again, over the holiday season, the Biden administration is already upside down in every polling related to the economy. This release is not going to have an effect on short term. Their goal is to get short-term gas prices down. That may happen 10, 15 cents a gallon. But folks, in the big picture, it's not going to be material and it'll evaporate quickly. Biden's economic advisors have come to the conclusion that inflation is going to be with us through at least Q2 or worst case Q3 heading into 2022. And as we've been telling you for months, if they have inflation running at these levels in Q3 of 2022, you're talking about losing 50 to 60 seats in the House of Representatives, Republicans regaining control of the Senate, and Democrats shifting to the far left is not going to help them here. But that's the big news overnight. Now, look, let me shift away sort of from the economics here to some, social political things going on. This, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Waukesha, Waukesha, however it's pronounced in Wisconsin, where the suspect was arrested, charged with 5 counts of murder. BLM militants are basically using this, stating it was done on purpose to start a revolution. Okay, I'm not going to take those people at their word at all. It's disgusting what's happened here, but what's really sad, folks, this comes on the heels of the Kyle Rittenhouse acquittal. The media and some far left-wingers in the Democratic Party and their allies in the media are already starting to politicize this, making excuses for the criminal, the 37, 38, 39-year-old criminal who has a rap sheet the length of, from my head to my toe, and who was out on $1,000 bail, that's outraged people. You're already starting to see and hear the racial components of this case, and the charges are just barely filed. Again, folks, we're not going to pre-try this case. It's not fair to the victims. It's not fair to the person that drove the vehicle into the crowd. But to hear BLM militants politicizing this thing, and to hear commentators on television, again, it's the same culprits, CNN over and over. It's just disgusting, folks. So, we're going to let this thing play itself out, but right now it's certainly not gotten off to a good start. And, we talk a little bit about, the crime situation in our blue cities. It's just terrible. Reports came out today, Washington, D.C., again, the bluest of blue cities in the country, had its 200th homicide. I mean, it's the highest on record since 2004. And folks, these Democratic policies, along with the racial tensions that the Biden administration, is allowing to happen, it's just creating a toxic environment out there. But again, having said that, I want to give you one more piece of political news, and then we're going to get on to some really great topics concerning the Pilgrims, the founding of this country, the Mayflower Compact, because we've got a really special guest with you today. But, we've talked a little bit about polls, and it's really too early. But, a couple things are starting to emerge. it does look like President Trump is building a war chest, and it does look like he's going to run. Now, there's other Republicans thinking about running too. Tom Cotton, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, to name a few, Ted Cruz possibly. Now, what the calculus will be after the 2022 midterms when the president makes his decision, former president makes his decision, anybody's guess at this point. But polling from 5 swing states, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, okay, and Nevada, they show that President Trump would win all those states comfortably. So again, with Biden's poll numbers in the tank, again, head-to-head matchups this far out don't mean a whole lot. I don't want to confuse you, but the early indications are that's where we stand right now. But you've seen the news. We've recapped it for you. Now I want to bring in a special guest, and he's a friend of the show's. He's been on many times talking about arguments made before the Supreme Court, case law. Colonel John Eidsmoe, welcome back to Schaftlein Report. You've been a welcome guest many times. Happy to have you back on the show with me today.
Mark, it's always a joy to be with you, and especially at this time of year.
John, it really is. And, there's been some controversy in this country. Thanksgiving is normally a time when people come together as families. It hasn't been too controversial. But here again now, the far left-wing radicals, they actually went so far as to try to cancel Thanksgiving and got into it with the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal stood up to cancel culture and said, we're having none of this. We're going to portray our beliefs about Thanksgiving and the meaning of it the way it's traditionally been. John, you're chairman of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, okay? I want you to, tell our viewers a little bit about that, and then talk about the Mayflower Compact. It's a Christian document, the influence on our Declaration of Independence. Give our audience some perspective as the chairman of the Plymouth Rock Foundation.
I'll be happy to, and I should say that I'm chairman of the board of directors of the foundation. The actual president of the foundation is somebody that is pretty well known to probably a good share of your audience, Paul Jaley, who lives there in the Plymouth area. And he has been the heart and soul of the foundation for decades. But as chairman of the board, I'm certainly coming along beside him and trying to do my best to promote the ideals of the Pilgrims. That's what the foundation is for, to share the gospel of Jesus Christ through the worldview that was brought here by the Pilgrims in 1620. I just got back from Plymouth last night. We had the most remarkable time there, a great Thanksgiving parade, in which not only did we have turkey and things like that, but we also had the replica of the Mayflower. We had pilgrims marching in period dress and military bands and so on. It was a remarkable occasion, but one thing that also made it unique was that we had quite a number of the chiefs of many of the First Nations of this country.
Wow.
For example, we had a Mohawk chief. The Mohawk, of course, were part of the Iroquois Confederacy. We had an Apache and Navajo chief and several from the Lakota tribe. And the idea that the groups within the First Nations or Native American community that are trying to create a conflict between whites and the Native Americans or whites and others, that they don't speak for a lot of the Native Americans. Many of them are Christians. In fact, there is an organization with the acronym of CHIEF, C-H-I-E-F, that is composed entirely of leading Native Americans for the purpose of promoting the gospel. And they are some of the most remarkable people that I have had a chance to talk to in a long time. I am not Native American myself, but on my mother's side, my family is married in with the Lakota in western South Dakota. And so there's a lot to be identified with there. But you do know probably that there has been a movement within the last year or so to make 1619 rather than 1620 the actual defining moment or beginning of America. The 1619 project was established by the New York Times with a reporter for the New York Times, a journalist named Nicole Hannah Jones, and the whole August 2019 issue was simply a series of articles by her and by a number of others that basically were designed to say that America was from its inception a racist
Right.
slave nation,
Right.
and that is what has defined America ever since.
Yeah.
And many liberal historians even have been very critical of the sloppy scholarship that the project is engaged in, as well as the misleading direction of it. But what we in the foundation want to insist on, we certainly don't claim that our founding fathers are perfect by any means, but they were people of God. They came here because they wanted the freedom to worship God as they believed the Bible commands that he be worshiped. And they set up a system of government through the Mayflower Compact that I'll be glad to talk about.
Yes.
That
Please.
not only is it remarkable, but it has been the basis for laws and constitutions for 400 years since that time.
John, isn't one of the reasons Nicole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times, again, which folks, these are borderline, just far left-wing radical concepts, and to have the New York Times lend any credibility to it, again, many people just feel the New York Times has gone off the edge. And Nicole Hannah-Jones herself profited tremendously from pitching this nonsense. And again, what she does and what the Times is doing is spreading racial divisions in this country, basically referring to everything the United States and our culture is bad within a radical revolutionary idea to burn it down and restart the country. John, isn't that where this whole garbage of a 1619 project, isn't that where the energy is coming from on the Democratic side of the ledger?
I would say very much so. In fact, the motto that used to be right at the top of the New York Times every day was all the news that's fit to print.
Right.
I think they need to change that. They need to say now all the news that fits,
Right.
that fits their own worldview and the propaganda that they're trying to put out. But you are absolutely correct. And it is based on what we call critical race theory, the idea that race has been the central defining factor of history, and that the whole history of the human race has been a history of conflict between oppressors, which is white males, white Christian males, and the oppressed, which is everybody else. And anyway, so wherever they can create division, wherever they can cause people to start hating one another or becoming suspicious of one another, that's exactly what this is all about. But that certainly was not the direction of the Pilgrims. Now, while I was up there, I had the privilege of staying in a home that is called the Leiden House, because the Pilgrims, when they came to America, they had first spent 10 years in the Netherlands. They had left England to go to the Netherlands and spent about 10 years there, and found that that wasn't working out like they hoped, that the Netherlands practiced religious toleration, but they found in the Netherlands that there was a lot of license, a lot of immorality, a lot of rank heresy. And really, I think that did a lot to refine the Pilgrims' view of what religious liberty was to be, because I think they saw from the experience in Leiden in the Netherlands that just simple liberty without a moral and religious base behind it leads to degeneration, it leads to license, it leads to destruction. And they knew that true liberty has to be based on law and morality. And I think that helped to shape their view of liberty when they came to America. But when they came to America, those who came, there were 102 on the Mayflower. Many of these were pilgrims, but some were not. Some were simply coming over here because they wanted to find a new life in America, and the Pilgrims called them the strangers. But when they were originally coming, they were going to be coming to Virginia because they had contracted with the Virginia Company to come and plant a colony in the northern parts of Virginia. But they were blown off course and found themselves in the Plymouth Harbor in Massachusetts instead, which meant that they were no longer under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. And many of us think that was providential. It gave them the freedom to establish a colony, not like Jamestown, but something different. Now, a number of the strangers, those who were not part of the Pilgrim Covenant, said, okay, great, this means that we're free to live however we want to live. And Bradford and Brewster and the others, as part of the Pilgrim group said, absolutely not. That would never work. You can't live in a state of license like that. Human nature is such that that would simply lead to all sorts of evils. And so before they went ashore, they drafted a compact that we know today as the Mayflower Compact.
Right.
And it's remarkable. And if you want me to do so, I'll be very happy to talk a little bit about what is in that Mayflower Compact.
Well, I would like you to. I mean, it's a Christian document, and I would like you to talk about how the Mayflower Compact was really an influence on the Declaration of Independence and sort of tie those two in together, if you would, John.
Let's do that. And as we begin, maybe we should look at some of the actual language of the compact itself. And it begins with the words, "In the name of God, Amen." That tells you where they're coming from at the beginning. "We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subject of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith." Now consider that for just a minute, that they are not exactly friends of King James. In fact, James has said he is going to harry them out of the land. And they went to the Netherlands to get away from James and his edicts. And they came to America to get away from him. But they still recognize that he is king. And they say he's king of Great Britain, but also of France and Ireland. And Britain's claims to the King of England having claims over France, and that the throne of France rightly belonged to England, they were even willing to grant King James that claim. But then they go on to say, "having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country." Now, that doesn't necessarily sound like Massachusetts today, does it?
No,
but it
far
certainly
from
was
it.
Massachusetts in those days. "A voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia," as I say, they were blown off course, "do by these presents mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation." In other words, they know that human nature being what it is, people cannot live in a state of anarchy.
No.
We need government. And so they say, better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, that is, the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and reaching out to the natives that they would find here and sharing the gospel with them. That was a major part of their concern, and they went through great efforts to this effect.
John, let me ask you this, and I'm fast forwarding now, but when we have situations like the 1619 project versus 1620, when we have, an attack on the Declaration of Independence, when we have trying to get rid of Thanksgiving, John, there's a moral deficiency in those arguments. Can you share a little bit about from, again, where we were 400 years ago to where we are now? Because some things are similar, but there are some moral issues starting to come to the surface now that are similar to where we experienced 400 years ago.
Well, the racism issue, of course, and other things like that. But in fact, the 1619 project, if some of our audience may not be aware why it's called that, but they are going back to an event in 1619 where a English pirate ship captured a Portuguese man of war that had slaves on it, and then brought those slaves to the North American coast and passed them off to the people of Jamestown. And that's the introduction of slavery to the American colonies. Although certainly slavery was by no means a stranger to North America before that time. Many of the Native Americans, particularly those south of the border, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, and so on, had slavery. In fact, the Aztecs had 5 classes of slavery. And of the North American Indians, some of them did and some of them did not. So slavery was not a stranger to America at that time, but here it is introduced to the Jamestown colonists. Now, to say that that is the definitive experience of America, I think is very unfair. In fact, Hannah Jones makes the statement there that this begins a brutal system of slavery that is unlike anything the world had ever seen. That is absolute nonsense.
Of course it is.
Slavery was rampant in Africa. It was especially rampant among the Muslim nations, and they would capture not only black slaves from further south in Africa, but also European slaves as well. It was true in Europe. It was true in Asia. It's been true throughout the world. And I am not minimizing slavery by saying this. I mean, I'm a pastor.
Right.
I preach, and I'll be preaching the night before Thanksgiving. I'll be preaching, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The fact that sin is universal doesn't mean I'm saying it's okay because everybody does it.
Right.
Same with slavery. It's just saying that that does not define America. And if you look to like galley slaves on Muslim ships and so on like that, slaves that are chained to the oars and so on, I would say that is a much more brutal system of slavery than anything existed in the United States.
Right.
But it's interesting that Mayflower, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, please finish. Please finish.
The Mayflower Compact, though, goes on to say that because we're trying to pursue these ends, that we will enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices. Just and equal. Just, first of all, meaning in accordance with the higher law of God. As Jefferson would say in the Declaration a century and a half later, the laws of nature and of nature's God. Equal in the sense that although we don't guarantee everybody the same amount of wealth or the same amount of accomplishments, and not everybody's going to end up at the same point at the finish line, nevertheless, we do believe that everybody is equally loved of God. Everybody has the same way of salvation, and everybody is equal before the law. And that concept goes right back here to the Mayflower Compact.
Yes, it does. And John, throughout from that period of time to present day, it's always these liberal Democrats trying to, rewrite history, change our laws, erase history. And, it's just people are fed up with it. They're not going to tolerate it, as evidenced by, what happened in Virginia recently. And people just reached a point where enough is enough. We're tired of hearing this crap. The country is built upon a certain foundation, and we're going to grow based upon what that foundation was laid. And there is more opportunity in this country than any other country in the world. And the United States took steps as a leader to, take steps to eradicate the slavery issue from back in the 1600s and moving forward. So to have the New York Times and Jones, put forth this garbage, it's really sort of disgusting.
Absolutely. I would agree there completely. And I'd add further that the real definitive aspect of America in this regard is not that we had slavery. We did, and it was wrong. And it's not just the South. The Northeast actually conducted the slave trade. So it's America, and America is at fault there. But I would ask, where can you find anywhere else in the world other than in Judeo-Christian societies where people have actively worked to free slavery, to free slaves? I would say that the real definitive aspect of America in this regard is not that we had slavery. The real definitive aspect of America is that we worked so hard to eliminate slavery. And yes, some of our founding fathers were slaveholders, that is true. But they don't want to tell us about how many of those founding fathers were also members of abolition societies and very strongly opposed to slavery, just a few of them. Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, the man we sometimes call the father of the American Revolution, John Adams, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, James Otis, John Jay, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Gouverneur Morris, the man who wrote most of the final draft of the Constitution. And I could go on and on with the list here of those that were outspoken in their opposition to slavery, and those who actually, in many cases, belonged to and even formed abolition societies. So that's the real story of America. Yeah. Another part of the story of America I think has to be mentioned here too, and that is that right outside in the lawn before the Leyden House where I was staying, back in the year 1621, there was a peace treaty signed at that time between the Pilgrims and Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag. This created peace between these people, that a peace that lasted for over 50 years.
Yep.
And I think the Pilgrims deserve a great deal of credit for this, as do the Wampanoag.
Well, John, it's really interesting. You bring a historical perspective to this, the Pilgrims versus the Puritans. And then, I'm sort of tying what happened back in those times to where we are today. And I'm saying, why would anyone in their right mind want to rewrite what is a truly American holiday celebrated by Americans? Shed some light on your thoughts here this Thanksgiving, John, for all our viewers and listeners throughout the podcast.
Well, again, even Thanksgiving itself has been rewritten. In fact, there are some, even in the schools, that have been teaching that the Pilgrims held Thanksgiving to thank the Indians, when that is not quite correct. They had their Thanksgiving to thank God and to thank God together. They invited Indians to come to the feast, and some say the Indians were forced to be there. That doesn't seem very likely. Let's consider the facts here. We had 102 that came over. Of those, over 50 died in that first winter. And there in Plymouth, as you look down upon the shore there with Plymouth Rock down below you there, by the way, if you look at Plymouth Rock, it's surrounded by these large pillars. It's a magnificent display as it is right now. And I've said that I'm glad those pillars are there, because if they weren't, the Pilgrims wouldn't have found it. But at any rate, up there on the hill, there is a large stone sarcophagus. And inside that sarcophagus are the bones of many of those Pilgrims who died that first winter. Now, I'm mentioning this to point out that by the end of that winter, the number of the colony had gone down to about 50. Of these, over half were women and children. Of the men, some of them were elderly, some of them were not in good health. And to this group of about 50, mostly women and children and older men in bad health, you bring 90 armed Wampanoag braves. You really think that they were being coerced by this little sickly band of Pilgrims?
Of course
I don't think so.
No, of course not. Of course not. Hey, let's fast forward, John. I want to ask you a couple. You've got a legal background. You've argued cases before the Supreme Court. We got a couple minutes left in the show here. I want to get you to give our audience an update on a couple things. One, Americans are buying more guns now than they've ever been buying before, based upon all the racial tensions, all the government efforts perceived efforts to register firearms, etc. That's point number one. Point number two, the Supreme Court has a couple high-profile cases that they're going to talk about in this next year. Both of them have to do with a controversial issue, abortion. One's a Mississippi case, one's a Texas case. Give us your thoughts on those, because you've argued, you've sent letters to the Supreme Court, you've wrote amicus briefs. You and the Supreme Court are pretty well tied in together at the hip. Give our viewing and listening audience a preview of what they expect to see relative to these two cases.
Well, I think if you were to talk to Justice Thomas or Justice Roberts or something, and you mentioned John Eidsmoe, they'd say, who?
Maybe
we filed
not.
Briefs. We filed many briefs before the courts, and the justices, I'd like to think, read them. Certainly their clerks read them. Certainly their staff attorneys read them. But I don't want you to give the impression here that the Supreme Court justices and I are.
Well, you've got quite an experience, so I'll leave it.
That's claiming more credit. But on the issue of guns, think about that issue for a moment. The Second Amendment clearly states that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Mm-hmm. And there was an issue that was before the court some years ago, whether this involves the right of individuals to have arms or whether it just involves the right of the state to have a state militia. Well, the Supreme Court in the Heller versus DC case, and then more recently in the McDonald case, has now affirmed very clearly that it is an individual right. Mm-hmm. Just reading it shouldn't tell you that, but anyway, that's been affirmed. And yes, you're correct on this, that we are seeing an increase in the number of people buying guns today. Mm-hmm. And ever think there might be a connection between that and the defund the police movement?
100%. I mean,
if you can't count on the police, you're going to have to protect yourself.
Absolutely.
In fact, I I saw a sign up there in Plymouth. The guy with a gun shop and an outfitter shop had a bunch of these metal signs there. And one of them said, I'd rather have a pistol in my hand than a cop on my phone, which is going to do you more good. I
Well,
mean, I think it was understood that, well, we certainly value the police.
oh yeah,
They're not going to be able to protect us all the time from crime. They're certainly not in the old days,
right.
even before we had the means of calling them. But even if you call 911, it's still going to take some time for police to arrive, and they'll probably arrive just in time to identify the bodies.
Right, and
But
and support for gun control is at an all-time low level, John. So again, every time, it's just predictable. Every time there's one of these mass events, you see Democrats, gun control, the public doesn't support it. And with these efforts, and you see these crime in these cities, people want to defend themselves. All right, a couple minutes left. John, Mississippi and Texas, give our audience a perspective about what they
let's make a transition here between the gun issue and the baby issue.
Yep.
I've got a bumper sticker that is on my door here at the office. It says, if babies had guns, they wouldn't be aborted. Make sure every little baby is armed, and maybe that's the way to stop abortion. But we have a very interesting case before the Supreme Court, a couple of them actually, but I'll focus in the interest of time here just on the Mississippi case. Mississippi has adopted a law that prohibits abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy, whereas the Supreme Court, up to this point, has been saying that the state cannot prohibit abortion until after the point of viability, which in Roe versus Wade, the court says was at the end of the 6th month. And it seems with medical science now, they're saying that's much earlier, like maybe the 9th month or the 5th month or even before. But if the Mississippi law is going to be upheld, Roe versus Wade is going to have to be either overruled or modified.
Right.
Here at the foundation, we filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, jointly with Lutherans for Life, urging the Supreme Court to overrule Roe versus Wade, arguing that this viability test, the point at which the child can survive outside the womb, is a very subjective test. It's a doctor's opinion as to whether that child could survive. It's going to vary with the individual. Some kids are going to be healthier than others. It varies with the state of medical technology at the time and so on. In contrast to other tests like conception, where when a child is conceived, we certainly at that point have all the DNA that determines what that child is and what traits that child is going to manifest. We also, by the point of about the 18th day after conception, we have a heartbeat, which can be detected about 2 or 4 weeks after conception. There is a rock hard science. Either there's a heartbeat or there isn't. That makes a much better test than the viability test. And I am optimistic that the Supreme Court will see it that way. The real issue, I think, is what they're going to do with Roe versus Wade. I think very, very likely, I'm reluctant many times to make predictions of what the court is going to do, but I will predict that the Supreme Court is going to uphold the Mississippi law. Whether they do so by completely overruling Roe versus Wade or just modifying Roe versus Wade and saying the state can regulate abortion long before the viability issue arrives, I'm not sure on that. I'm hoping they'll overrule it entirely. It was a bad decision from the beginning, and it's way, way overdue to overrule it.
John, when is that case going before the court?
It's going to be argued before the court on December 1st.
Oh,
wow. But as far as when the decision will be released, most likely that will be at the end of the term, which will be next June. And I wouldn't be surprised if, as we get to the end of June, that may well be the very last decision that they release.
Wow. Okay. Well, John, I'll tell you what, that's great insight, and we will stay on top of it. And as developments happen, post those arguments in December, we'll have you back on to give your analysis as the case comes, particularly towards June, as you mentioned. John, I can't thank you enough for coming on our show today and giving us your insights, from being up in Plymouth, where the Pilgrims came ashore, tying it in with Thanksgiving. And I wish the best to you and your family for a happy Thanksgiving coming up as we celebrate a great American tradition.
I appreciate that. And in fact, I urge the audience, if every year we have a major celebration, the Thousands of people come to in Plymouth the weekend before Thanksgiving. And I'd urge you to go to our website, just to Google Plymouth Rock Foundation, and also another group that we work very closely with there, the Leiden, Leiden, Preservation Group. And I urge you to Google these and see firsthand what is going on up there. You'll be impressed. And blessed Thanksgiving to all.
Great closing comments, John. And for all our viewing audience, we'll be back tomorrow. Jeffrey Dunitz is our guest on a pre-Thanksgiving holiday. John, thank you again for joining us today. Happy Thanksgiving, and we will see you soon. Have a good evening.